Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our series of interviews with participants and contributors to our Coronavirus and International Affairs Conference. And it is my singular pleasure to introduce the person who's served us as the voice of Africa in this context. And for those of you who've been following the blog posts as run up to the conference, you've seen reporting from Jonathan Kiwana, who I am delighted to have gotten to agree to a short interview with us today. He's a former student of ours, for which I was just thrilled to death to be able to spend some time with him. He's now a senior associate with Bowman's, corporate commercial top tier Pan-African law firm, focusing and advising primarily financial institutions, multinational enterprises, energy companies on commercial transactions in East Africa. He has, over the course of his practice, because not only is he got strong academic skills, but he's a practicing lawyer, which is a rarity among us. He, as a lawyer, has performed securities reviews for leading banks, advised on listings on the Uganda Securities Exchange and the Nairobi Exchange, advised oil companies on offshore operations. He's also acted in the Supreme Court of Uganda for a former managing director of Uganda's largest pension fund who is accused of white-collar crimes. And for the last 3 years, he's been invited to the African Leadership Forum hosted by former African presidents, having addressed the General Assembly for one of these meetings. He's passionate, and I can attest to this, he's passionate about matters of human rights, rule of law, good governance, and constitutionalism, and often writes on these matters. So welcome, Jonathan. And what I wanted to do to get us started was perhaps you can speak to us a little bit about the way that Uganda in particular, but perhaps Uganda in the context of Central Africa, Uganda has confronted the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you for having me. My name is, as you heard, I'm Jonathan. Currently in Uganda. It's really hot here, as opposed to what Professor looks like. It must be cold there. But yes, and Uganda is located in East Africa, just west of Kenya and north of Tanzania. Those of you who have a rough idea of your African geography, that's where Uganda is. It's a little country. And like most of, as you may know, COVID-19 got to Africa last, like many other things. So when the rest of the world had started to suffer COVID-19, it got to Uganda much later, about a month later from the rest of the world. To date, there are about, as of this morning, there are about 55 cases of the coronavirus in Uganda. And no deaths yet. Actually, there have been more recoveries. So mostly recoveries, not deaths yet. But the country, and because the virus got here much later, the country has taken gradual and maybe more relaxed steps, not casual, but less drastic steps than the rest of the world, but still serious enough to contain the virus. As currently we are under a lockdown, which is estimated to run up to about 5th May for now, which will be about 6 weeks lockdown, which I know maybe is much less than certain other places, but yeah, that's what's happening. And the lockdown has taken the form that people do not move after 7 p.m. Only essential services are allowed to move, and even then with a limited number of people in cars and things like that. And yeah, there's no air transport apart from cargo. And yeah, to help people manage, the government has asked financial institutions to consider restructuring of loans. There's been an increase, certain manufacturers have been asked to take on any manufacturing of essential healthcare equipment and things like that. Uganda, as you may know, is a developing country. So we've not, there are about 53 ventilator beds in the whole country for a population of about 40 million. So if, the coronavirus went spread far into the population, it would have, as you can imagine, far-reaching effects. So the government has taken efforts to contain the virus as opposed to treating or finding cures. So it's more of a containment. So all the people that are sick have been contained in a certain area, and they're doing regular testing of all the people that they did come into contact with, all the people who've been outside the country in the last 1 month, as many as they can are being tested. So yeah, that's in brief how the government is handling it. It's been as you can imagine, scary time, but also I think has provided us a lot of time to reflect on where we lie. I dare say it does present some positive or some opportunities for the continent. As regards our neighbors, other countries, Kenya, South Africa, have taken on a similar model as Uganda of the lockdown, curfew, strict regulation. That has not been the case with, and in fact, Rwanda in East and Central Africa was the first take on that model. Rwanda took on, and as you can imagine, with the president, Paul Kagame, in fact, his has always been a model of sort of a semi-dictatorship, if you will. So the instructions just came as of tomorrow, I've shut down the country, and that was it. No more weddings, no nothing, and people just fell in line, which maybe the rest of the countries have taken a more relaxed mode, but have eventually ended up there. Tanzania, on the other hand, has been the extreme end. Tanzania is just Rwanda is south of Tanzania, has taken on Tanzania has taken a more relaxed mode. The president is attending large church gatherings. He's going to markets like nothing's happened. So Tanzania at the moment has about 20 cases of the COVID-19. So we'll see how that goes. Maybe that's why they're the way they are. Yeah, so in a brief, that's the long and short of what it looks like at the moment.
All right, I've got a question for you. If that's the case, how have these neighboring countries dealt with border issues? Because certainly if Kenya and Uganda are taking stricter measures and Tanzania is not, the issue of allowing people in and out may have a significant impact. I recall the fight now, or the tensions within Europe, where you have the same problem between Sweden that's taken a more relaxed attitude, and other countries in Europe. So I was wondering how you were dealing with that.
Yeah, that has been also a point of contention, actually. Uganda is a landlocked country, meaning it's surrounded by countries all around. So it does need, and most of our goods come from Kenya, which is at the coast, and Tanzania. So the goods come at the coast by the ocean, and then they're driven from the coast into Uganda. So the measure that have been taken is that there is no, the directive has been that there should not be no people coming into the country or going out, and Tanzania, and so far Kenya has cooperated in that regard, and Rwanda, but the only thing that's allowed in are cargo trucks. The borders are quite porous, so that's been difficult to manage. But somehow there's been an understanding even before between between the countries and the presidents. So that's not been much trouble. Just that it's been difficult to manage. The directives and the truck drivers as of today are now being tested. Those who come in, they are required to take a test for the coronavirus, and then told the results whenever they're ready. It presents logistical issues, but I think the government is trying as much as possible to regulate while allowing normal life to happen as much as possible.
Okay. I've got a question, though, about all of this. In some countries, and particularly the United States, I know that this goes to your other life as a constitutional scholar. um, we've we've begun to see some elements of the population beginning to use law, and especially constitutional law, to resist some of the measures, especially the stricter measures imposed by the government. Just recently, a number of churches have sued, for example, the California state governor with respect to the measures that made it impossible to hold church services. In other states, the executive orders or legislative efforts in that respect have been overturned. And I was wondering whether we see the same kind of activity, either constitutional activity that supports whatever extraordinary methods are taken, or whether there is any action of this sort against some of the activities that are being proposed by officials.
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting thing. There has been discussions. I'm a member of the Bar Society here, and amongst the legal fraternity, there was discussions about the legality of some of these directives. Many of them were not properly passed, because ideally there should have been a call for a state of emergency and then gone through the legal hoops. And there was a draft petition that had been filed to annul these directives and whatnot. And but as I say, draft, it hasn't gone far. It has been withdrawn since. I think people have taken on the attitude that this, in light of everything that's happening, and people kind of think, the actions are justified, may not be legal, but perhaps justified. The attitude has been to let it slide. In Kenya, there has been a suit that has been filed by the churches asking that they be labeled as essential services to allow them to keep running. And as I don't know if you know that a lot of Africa is religious, so that kind of suit may hold water, at least, politically. It can turn quite politically sensitive. Having said that, I generally, at least from what has happened in Rwanda and Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, African populations are used to taking instructions from leaders, even when they're in bad faith, and not questioning them. Yeah, some may call that dictatorships, unconstitutional. So, and maybe that's why it's been easier to enforce these limitations without much resistance. People are used to this sort of thing, and they're used to it being done with brutality. I mean, for example, people that have broken curfew, in some places, the police have, just beaten them up. So, and the president has tried to stop the police and whatnot and contain them, but there's not been much backlash. I think people are used to this sort of thing. So when it comes for a good cause, there's little resistance to it constitutionally, or people have not bought into the whole thing. Those are the only cases I've heard of, perhaps, and in South Africa too, there's been a few petitions. Yeah, but not very loud.
Okay.
Yeah.
What role, I want to turn our attention just a little bit to Pan-African issues. And there are two questions. They're not necessarily related, but I want to throw them out, and you can put them together or take them apart as you like. One question deals with, and they both, in a sense, touch on Pan-Africanism and African unity. So the first one is, to what extent or has there been any significance to any divisions between, let's say, West Africa, the sphere of influence around Nigeria, for example, and the course taken by East and South African, the Uganda, Kenya on the one hand, and South Africa on the other, and is that showing up somehow in relations among African states? And then the second question, which kind of builds on that, is to what extent has the African Union stepped in the context of COVID-19 to either manage, oversee, provide a forum, provide a central point for discussion, or whatever?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Unfortunately, there's not been a very united front in dealing with COVID-19 on the continent. It's sort of been every state for itself. I was reading this morning a McKinsey report on how to tackle the COVID-19, and that's one of the things I was saying. Perhaps African states should have a general procurement platform in this season for protective equipment and things like that, that could help, since many of the countries seem to have similar problems and a homogeneous response. And unfortunately, there's not been much a united front in that regard as to how people have responded. It's sort of been every country on its own, and maybe a few leaders consulting with one another. But sadly, the African Union has been silent at such a time as this, and I've not had much from the regional blocs like SADC or ECOWAS in West Africa. The African voice that has been more prominent in this time has been the African Development Bank and the Afri-Exim Bank, which has, the Africa Development Bank has issued a social bond of about, I think, $3 billion on the London Stock Exchange to raise funding for COVID-19 response and the stimulus packages. Afri-Exim Bank, I think, has also set aside some money. I'm not sure, I forget how much, but a fairly good amount of money, perhaps $1 billion. I can't remember. Still towards a stimulus package for that and to assist governments. But largely, it's been every nation on its own. There's been, for example, in Uganda, there's been a lot of private sector-led initiatives with the private sector working together with governments. I know in Nigeria, the Aliko Dangote Foundation has been leading the way in that regard to fund stimulus packages. The Nigerian Bar Association, for example, has been providing support to lawyers in this time who've had difficulty and such things. So it's been more private sector working with governments. And, a few, I know the World Bank has set aside some money, but it's still see how far that will go. So it's not been much, in short, there's not been much as the United Front as one would have expected. It's been more governments coming up with initiatives to sort the issue.
Okay. And you brought up actually a very interesting point that tends to be ignored or marginalized to some extent as people focus on the state, and that is the role of the private sector. Africa, of course, has a long history of having to deal with two kinds of private sectors, the indigenous private sector and multinational enterprises. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about to what extent you see action or responsible conduct, either coming from the indigenous economic sector or from multinational enterprises, either Western or Asian.
Yeah, there has been, I think the private sector, both indigenous and multinational, has tried to play their part in the best way they can. I think everyone is just responding in shock to what's happening and doing what they can. I know that certain companies have laid aside money to for example, in Uganda, Pepsi has given about something close to maybe $1 million. Vivo Energy and such organizations across Africa have given towards stimulus packages or helping governments acquire whatever protective equipment. Even NGOs, I know of a UK NGO, UK registered charity, Child's Eye Foundation, that has been giving towards vulnerable people in this season. So there's been, again, scattered responses, and perhaps both from multinationals and indigenous response. Everyone just sort of doing whatever they can. But I guess it has exposed that, like all disasters, no one was prepared, no one saw this coming. It's sort of how, the financial crisis happens. Everyone just does what they think best at that point. And maybe we'll look back and see who did right at that point. Interestingly, I think it provides us with a great opportunity as African nations to kind of develop internal solutions. You know, the age-old song maybe is now coming to life, especially now that you know, China is engaged with repairing themselves. The US is equally repairing itself while it's preparing for an election. You know, the EU is sort of shut down. Yeah, and somehow you find yourself trying to sort out issues. For example, there's been a lot of advancement of e-services, e-delivery, which, you know, is a strange phenomenon in the continent, whereas there's a big gap of low internet and slow internet speeds are slow. There's also, on another hand, a lot of app development on the continent, and you know, more, internet banking, phone banking. So it's been interesting how that has turned out. There's been a lot of more money transactions by phone because banks are sort of inaccessible in this season. So it's provided a sort of different paradigm. You know, it's been a paradigm shift that perhaps some of these things we can sort ourselves. We can sort by ourselves.
Okay. And speaking of paradigm shifts, and maybe to bring the this conversation, I'm tempted to go on for another hour, but maybe, but it will kill you and exhaust our listeners. But to bring this maybe to a close, speaking about paradigm shifts, everyone is speaking about that in some way that reflects their own view of what's important. But I was wondering if you can speak to us in closing this, how the COVID pandemic may reflect on the future of international relations, especially from an African perspective.
Yeah, thank you. That's wow, that's a big one. Who knows? we can only wait and see. But I think it may question the power that maybe certain entities have held out to have. And again, this is something where we can only wait and see what will come of it. But for example, I mean, typically Uganda imports close to, you know, each year about imports worth about $10 million US. But now there's not been much importation. And the president the other day was saying, perhaps you people can take that money you've been sending out and open those industries here. So I think it may cause a certain shift in power, or a shift in allegiances, that especially where the relations have been more to do with this person's giving me money or not, there may be a question. On the other hand, it could also do the reverse. Perhaps African nations may also become more dependent, especially if they suffer very badly economically. It could put many states in a place where now they're depending more and more on handouts because of what this has happened, especially where there's already been weak systems. Who knows what could happen in that regard. So I think it's too early to tell, but I think all I can say at this point is it's an opportunity. For those who wanted to cause a shift, it could be an opportunity to quickly shift allegiances, or to quickly turn things around, or start to turn them around. But also it could put states in a place where they instead become more dependent. Perhaps it goes back to a question of leadership, the age-old, you know, how will leaders respond at such a time as this? We can only wait and see.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very, very much. This has been a truly informative interview. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And
a pleasure.
I hope that you will be available. I'm happy to pass along questions that our listeners may have to you. And if you've got the time, maybe you can answer them. But again, thank you very, very much. We appreciate it. Stay safe, and hopefully we can convince you to come and give another interview sometime soon.
We'll see. Sure. Stay safe, and thank you so much for having me.
All right.
Have a good day. It's evening here. So day. Bye.